Emily Carter was supposed to walk down the aisle and begin a new chapter of her life, but instead, she vanished without a trace, leaving Daniel Brooks standing at the altar in a town spiraling into suspicion. For 12 years, everyone believed she had run, disappeared, or been taken. But the truth was far more chilling. Emily never left the house. She had been there the whole time, buried beneath the floorboards, hidden by the man who claimed to love her most. Emily Carter had always dreamed of a perfect wedding. The kind with lace on her dress, rose petals scattered along a garden path, and soft piano music playing while everyone watched her walk down the aisle. Maple Glen, the quiet town where she had lived all her life, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and a wedding like hers was big news. People had followed her engagement to Daniel Brooks like a hometown fairy tale, the sweet girl from the florist's shop and the hard-working carpenter who fixed everyone's fences. For months, friends and neighbors had been counting down the days alongside the happy couple. The invitations were printed in gold letters, the flowers came fresh from Emily's own shop, and the ceremony was set to take place in Daniel's family backyard, right beneath a large oak tree. On the morning of the wedding, the sun was shining, the breeze was soft, and the house buzzed with energy. Bridesmaids in pastel dresses rushed around, giggling and sipping orange juice. The photographer took pictures of the rings resting on a velvet pillow. Daniel stood in the garden with his brother, adjusting his tie and shaking off nerves. Guests began to arrive and find their seats on white chairs arranged in neat rows. Everyone commented on how beautiful the setup looked, how lucky they were to have such perfect weather, and how happy Emily and Daniel seemed. But by early afternoon, a quiet tension began to settle in. The ceremony was supposed to begin at 2 o'clock. It was now 2:15, and there was no sign of the bride. People glanced at their watches. Some assumed she was taking a few extra moments to compose herself. Weddings could be overwhelming after all. Her maid of honor, Julia, went upstairs to check on her. When she came back down, her face was pale. She pulled Daniel aside and whispered something. His face went blank. Emily wasn't there. At first, people thought maybe she had gotten cold feet. Maybe she had stepped outside for air or needed a moment alone. But her phone, purse, and even her shoes were still in the bedroom. Her wedding dress had been laid out carefully on the bed, but it hadn't been touched. Her veil rested neatly on a chair, the comb still in place. The makeup artist said Emily had been cheerful and calm just 2 hours earlier. She'd helped Emily apply soft blush and lipstick and watched her smile into the mirror. Now, Emily was gone as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Panic spread through the house. The wedding was put on hold, then called off. Police arrived within the hour. The house was searched from top to bottom, the backyard scanned, the street canvassed. There was no sign of forced entry. No blood, no broken glass, just silence and confusion. Officers interviewed every guest, every vendor, every family member. Daniel told them he had been outside greeting guests and hadn't seen Emily since early that morning. Julia confirmed that she and the other bridesmaids had been helping Emily get ready around noon. Then they left the room to grab some food from the kitchen, and when they returned, she was gone. The back door of the house, near the staircase, was found slightly open. It didn't appear broken or forced, just left ajar. By sundown, search parties were organized. Volunteers combed the nearby woods, checked ditches, peeked into abandoned sheds. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs followed trails that ended abruptly at the end of the driveway. News vans arrived and reporters began filing live updates. The beautiful bride who had been about to walk down the aisle was now the center of a mystery. As night fell, the mood changed from hope to dread. The romantic decorations still hung around the yard, now eerily still. Plates of untouched food sat under tents. The DJ packed up his equipment without ever playing a song. Everyone went home quietly, unsure of what to say, unsure of what had just happened. The next morning, detectives returned with warrants. They examined the home closely, looking for hidden areas, signs of a struggle, or anything out of place. But everything was clean, too clean. Nothing suggested that a crime had taken place there, and yet Emily hadn't been seen since she entered that house. Daniel was questioned repeatedly. His story never changed. He had nothing to hide, he said. He was devastated, shocked, confused. He told police he had no idea where Emily went. Some believed him. Others weren't so sure. Rumors began to swirl throughout Maple Glen. Some wondered if Emily had discovered something that made her want to run. Others whispered about the strange way Daniel had kept calm during the chaos. A few claimed Emily had once talked about moving to California, though no one had ever confirmed it. The theories piled up, but no answers came. The town began to change. People locked their doors more often. Parents kept a closer watch on their kids. No one wanted to admit it, but everyone felt it, a deep unease, as if something dark had moved in and refused to leave. The police set up a tip line, followed dozens of leads, and checked surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and roads. Nothing turned up. The trail was cold from the very beginning. It was as if Emily had never existed at all. Weeks passed, then months. Her photo hung in the town square. Her family held a vigil on the 1-year anniversary. The case remained open, but no one was ever arrested. The house where the wedding was meant to take place became a quiet reminder of everything that had been lost. Daniel moved out a year later. The home sat empty for a while, then was sold to a new family. And in time, the story of the missing bride faded into the background of Maple Glen, a sad legend whispered over cups of coffee, or brought up at dinner parties when conversation ran dry. Emily Carter became a question no one could answer. But the truth was never far. It waited, silent and hidden, just beneath the surface. In the weeks following Emily's disappearance, Maple Glen became a town suspended in uncertainty. Every street corner bore her smiling face on missing person posters. The grocery store bulletin board, the library entrance, even the windows of her own flower shop were covered with reminders that she was gone. Strangers came into town offering help. Psychics claimed to sense her presence, and local police worked around the clock. But as days stretched into weeks and then months, the once burning urgency began to flicker and fade. Detectives followed every lead, no matter how strange or far-fetched. An elderly woman claimed to have seen Emily hitchhiking near the freeway. A gas station clerk reported someone matching her description buying snacks in the early morning hours. But none of these tips led anywhere. Surveillance footage failed to support the sightings. Emily's bank account remained untouched, and her phone had not pinged a tower since the morning of the wedding. Her digital footprint stopped cold. Daniel Brooks, now both a grieving fiancé and the center of suspicion, found himself walking a fine line. In public, he appeared calm and devastated, attending every press conference and cooperating with law enforcement. He gave interviews, stood beside Emily's family during televised pleas, and joined search teams that combed nearby forests. He opened their home to investigators, handed over passwords, and even took a polygraph, which he reportedly passed. Yet people still whispered. Emily's parents, Greg and Linda Carter, struggled to hold themselves together. Their only child, their pride and joy, had vanished on what should have been the happiest day of her life. Linda often stood by the living room window, staring at the driveway as if Emily might reappear there at any moment. Greg spent his evenings sitting in her old room, surrounded by untouched wedding decorations and unopened gifts. The silence in their home was unbearable. As the case grew colder, detectives began looking into Emily's past. They interviewed coworkers, high school friends, and college classmates. They asked about any history of depression, conflict, or unusual behavior. No one could think of a single reason Emily would choose to disappear voluntarily. She was well-liked, responsible, and deeply excited about her future. She had no known enemies, no legal trouble, and no secrets, at least none that anyone was aware of. Investigators even considered the possibility of an abduction. The back door being left open suggested someone might have entered, or that Emily could have fled. But there were no signs of struggle, no screams heard, no broken locks. The neighborhood was quiet, with houses spaced apart but close enough that any loud noise would have been noticed. No one reported anything suspicious. Meanwhile, Daniel's reputation continued to erode in the court of public opinion. Rumors about his past began to circulate. People said he had a temper, that Emily had second thoughts before the wedding, that she was planning to leave him. Former girlfriends came forward with stories of possessiveness and manipulation. While none of these claims were enough for an arrest, they added fuel to the fire. One particularly strange detail stood out in the early investigation. A month before the wedding, Daniel had done minor renovations to the upstairs hallway, near the master bedroom. He told friends he was fixing warped floorboards. He even joked that Emily's heels kept catching in the cracks. No one thought much of it at the time. Now, investigators wondered if there had been more to it. Still, no evidence was found linking him to a crime. Without a body, a witness, or a confession, the case remained just out of reach. Police quietly admitted they were out of leads. The search was scaled back. Media coverage faded. Other crimes took priority. Emily's flower shop, once filled with bright colors and sweet scents, closed down permanently. Her parents couldn't bear to walk past it. The couple who had planned to take their honeymoon in Hawaii never boarded the plane. The travel tickets, tucked away in Emily's desk, were never used. Her wedding dress, now infamous, was stored by her mother in a plastic garment bag, untouched since the day she disappeared. Daniel eventually returned to work. Life, in its cold and steady way, moved on. 5 years later, Daniel sold the house where they were supposed to marry. The memories inside had grown too heavy to carry. He relocated to another town and remarried a schoolteacher named Erin. Together they had a daughter, Sarah. To outsiders, it looked like Daniel had built a new life. But for those in Maple Glen, the story never faded completely. His name still came up in hushed conversations, especially around the anniversary of the wedding. Some believed he was guilty and had simply gotten away with murder. Others insisted he had been a victim too, that Emily's disappearance was a mystery unrelated to anything he'd done. Over time, the town seemed divided. And as the years passed, the story became more legend than case. A cautionary tale, a ghost story whispered at sleepovers, or a trivia fact shared with newcomers. 12 years passed. 12 long years in which Emily's parents aged under the weight of not knowing. 12 years during which the case file collected dust, buried under newer crimes and fresher faces. Her face, once bright and everywhere, faded into yellowed posters and locked filing cabinets. But beneath all the silence and forgetting, the truth remained where it had always been, hidden just out of reach, waiting to be found. It wasn't in the woods, or along a highway, or in some faraway place. It was closer than anyone imagined. While the town speculated and theories came and went, something dark and permanent stayed behind in that house on Oak Ridge Lane. The past never really disappears. It only waits, quietly, patiently. And one day, years later, it would finally rise to the surface. The house on Oak Ridge Lane sat quietly for several years after Daniel Brooks moved away. Though the lawn remained trimmed and the exterior paint still fresh, there was something lifeless about it. The kind of silence that didn't come from peace but from unresolved tragedy. Neighbors rarely spoke of it aloud, but they all knew the story. Children avoided it on Halloween. Real estate agents hesitated to show it. The shadow of Emily Carter's disappearance lingered like a heavy fog that never fully cleared. It wasn't until the Andersons bought the home that life seemed to return, at least on the surface. Harold and Nancy Anderson were a retired couple from a nearby city looking for a quiet place to settle down. They didn't grow up in Maple Glen and had only heard vague mentions of the missing bride case when they purchased the property. To them, the house was just another fixer-upper with good bones and a large backyard. They saw potential, not ghosts. Within weeks of moving in, they began renovations. Nancy focused on the garden, pulling weeds and planting hydrangeas. Harold, a retired electrician with a knack for carpentry, set out to fix the squeaky floors and loose railing on the staircase. The house, though in decent shape, still had the worn feel of a place that had seen too many memories. It was in early spring, about 2 months after they moved in, when the discovery happened. Harold had decided to replace the old hardwood floors in the upstairs hallway. The boards creaked loudly, especially near the bedroom at the end of the hall. He believed the subfloor had warped over time and wanted to fix it before the rainy season set in. One morning, he began tearing up the planks, starting closest to the bedroom door. As he worked, he noticed something strange. A section of the floor near the wall felt hollow beneath his hammer. Curious, he tapped it several times. It sounded different, as if something had been constructed underneath. He assumed it might be an old heating duct or possibly a patch job from the previous owner. Still, he decided to investigate further. He used a crowbar to lift the boards and was met with a layer of insulation. When he pulled that back, he discovered a narrow cavity, boxed in by plywood, almost like a sealed compartment. The air inside was musty and stale. As he peeled away the final layer, a sickening smell rushed out, one that stopped him cold. Inside the cavity lay what looked like cloth at first, then something more, bones, tangled, broken, and buried beneath a disintegrating white slip. Harold backed away in horror. He called for Nancy, but before she could reach the stairs, he shouted at her to stay back. Then he picked up the phone and called 911. Within the hour, the house was surrounded by flashing lights and yellow tape. Police officers moved in swiftly, followed by forensic teams in white suits. Word spread quickly through town. Emily Carter had been found. After 12 years of silence and speculation, her body had been resting beneath the floorboards just feet from where she had last been seen. The sealed compartment had been built into a hidden space between the floor and the support beams, carefully constructed and disguised. Whoever had placed her there had done so with intention and skill. There were no obvious signs of injury visible on the skeletal remains, but forensic pathologists quickly noted that her hyoid bone, a small bone in the neck, had been fractured. This detail pointed to a cause of death that had long been suspected but never proven: strangulation. For the investigators who had worked the original case, the discovery was both relieving and horrifying. They had searched that house countless times, but no one had ever thought to look beneath the floor. The original blueprints didn't show any extra compartments. The space had been added manually. Later inspection showed the wood used to seal the area was different from the original construction. It matched the kind sold at the local hardware store. Detectives began to rebuild the timeline with renewed focus. They combed through the original case files, examined financial records, and reviewed Daniel Brooks's movements before and after the wedding day. One detail stood out immediately. 3 weeks before the wedding, Daniel had made multiple purchases from a hardware store. The receipts showed plywood, nails, insulation, and a circular saw. At the time, these items had seemed irrelevant. Now, they were central. Investigators re-interviewed former witnesses, including construction workers Daniel had hired during that time. One recalled being asked to take a few days off around the week before the wedding because Daniel said he wanted to finish some personal work on the house. That detail had gone unnoticed for over a decade. They looked deeper into Daniel's background. Though his record was clean and he had maintained a reputation of being quiet and hardworking, cracks began to show. Several former girlfriends described him as controlling. One claimed he had once threatened her during an argument. Another said he hated being rejected, but none of this had ever reached a courtroom. Forensic experts matched DNA from the crime scene to items belonging to Emily, confirming her identity beyond any doubt. Soil samples from beneath the subfloor showed traces of blood proteins that had seeped through over time. A few strands of hair, long and brown, were still caught between the boards. The evidence, once scattered and circumstantial, was now solid and undeniable. Detectives secured a warrant for Daniel's arrest. By then, Daniel was living 2 towns over with his new wife and young daughter. He was arrested at his job site, where he was overseeing a home renovation. He didn't resist, didn't speak. As officers led him away in handcuffs, his face remained blank, a man watching his carefully buried secret rise from the depths after 12 long years. The town of Maple Glen, shaken to its core, gathered once more. This time not for a wedding, but for closure. Emily's remains were finally given a proper burial. Her parents stood graveside, holding each other in tears. A headstone was placed where it should have been all along, above the earth, in the light, not hidden in silence. The house on Oak Ridge Lane was sealed for months, now a full-blown crime scene. For the Andersons, it became a place they could no longer call home. They sold it and moved away, unable to live with what had been found beneath their feet. And for the rest of the town, the house became something else entirely, no longer just a symbol of a tragedy, but a reminder that some truths don't stay buried forever. Daniel Brooks was brought into the interrogation room under heavy guard. The same man who had once stood tearfully before news cameras pleading for help in finding his bride now sat in silence, hands cuffed, eyes distant. Detectives placed photos of the floor compartment, the hardware receipts, and the remains of Emily Carter on the table. Still, he said nothing. But the silence was no longer misunderstood. It wasn't grief. It was guilt. The trial preparation began swiftly. Prosecutors were confident they had a compelling case. For 12 years, Daniel had managed to live under the weight of a secret buried just inches beneath his old home. But now the evidence told the story he never wanted uncovered. The compartment had been custom-built. The timeline matched the week before the wedding, and only someone with carpentry knowledge and intimate access to the home could have created such a precise, hidden burial spot. The autopsy findings gave the case even more weight. The fractured hyoid bone was consistent with manual strangulation. There were no signs of trauma from blunt force or stabbing, no bullet wounds, just the unmistakable damage of being choked to death. And yet, there was more than just physical evidence. The emotional details started painting a deeper, more tragic picture. Emily's best friend Julia came forward with a letter she had never shown police. It had been written by Emily 2 nights before the wedding. In it, Emily expressed second thoughts, not about marriage itself, but about Daniel. She wrote that he had become short-tempered, increasingly possessive, and prone to jealousy. She wasn't sure she could go through with the ceremony. She feared that if she called it off, Daniel would react badly. Julia had thought the letter was just cold feet, a moment of doubt. She never imagined it was a warning. Investigators scoured Daniel's digital history. They found no smoking gun, but they did uncover deleted searches about how to silence someone permanently and how long does DNA last after death. Though circumstantial, these searches added to the growing list of evidence suggesting that Emily's death was not a spontaneous act of passion. It was planned. Witnesses at the trial recalled hearing Daniel and Emily argue during their engagement, including a particularly heated fight 2 weeks before the wedding. One neighbor testified that she heard shouting and something heavy falling late one night during that period. She hadn't reported it at the time. Now she regretted it. The courtroom was packed for every hearing. Locals who had followed the story from the beginning sat in silence, watching as the man once believed to be a victim was transformed, detail by detail, into the likely killer. Emily's parents sat in the front row, holding each other's hands tightly. They had waited over a decade to hear the truth spoken aloud. Daniel's defense team tried to argue that there was no direct evidence placing him at the scene during the time of death. They suggested someone else could have built the compartment, that Emily might have died from an accident or self-inflicted harm. But these theories didn't hold up against the forensic findings. The prosecution presented a clear timeline, matched materials, and a motive rooted in control and fear. The theory was chilling. Daniel learned that Emily wanted to cancel the wedding. Maybe she confronted him in the bedroom that morning. He reacted violently. Afraid of what would happen if the truth came out, he acted quickly, hiding her body in a compartment he had built specifically for that purpose. The renovations weeks earlier had not been innocent repairs. They were preparations. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The verdict was read aloud, guilty of second-degree murder. Daniel Brooks showed no emotion. His face remained expressionless, as if accepting the truth he had kept hidden for years had finally hollowed him out completely. The sentencing came weeks later. Emily's parents gave tearful statements, describing the pain of living each day not knowing what had happened to their daughter. Linda Carter spoke of sleepless nights, birthdays missed, and the empty chair at every holiday dinner. Greg Carter spoke of the anger he had swallowed for years, never knowing where to aim it. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His second wife, Erin, filed for divorce immediately after the trial ended. She had brought their daughter Sarah to the courthouse once to see her father, but after the trial she vowed never to bring the child again. "He is no longer part of our lives," she told reporters. Back in Maple Glen, the town tried to process the truth. The house where Emily had once hoped to start a new life was now infamous. No one wanted to live there. The property was purchased by a holding company and remained vacant. Eventually, the house was torn down. A small memorial garden was planted in its place, funded by donations from the community. Emily's funeral was held with hundreds in attendance. Her ashes were buried beneath a cherry tree in the local cemetery, not far from the school where she once volunteered. Friends and family spoke about her kindness, her love for flowers, and her gentle spirit. There were tears, of course, but also a sense of peace, because finally, after all the years of not knowing, Emily could rest. The story of Emily Carter became more than just a tragedy. It became a reminder of how appearances can deceive, how secrets can fester in silence, and how justice, though slow, can still arrive. It also reminded Maple Glen that the truth isn't always hidden in faraway places. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath your feet, in the very place where joy once lived. The town eventually moved forward, but the memory of the bride who vanished on her wedding day would never fade entirely. Her story remained carved into Maple Glen's history, a chilling lesson, a source of sorrow, and a call to never stop looking when someone goes missing. Because no matter how deep a secret is buried, the truth always finds its way to the surface. The day Daniel Brooks was transferred to state prison, a cold rain fell over Maple Glen. The town, though forever changed, seemed quieter in his absence. For years, his shadow had hung over the community like an unanswered question. Now, with his conviction final and sentence confirmed, people began to speak more openly. Conversations no longer danced around theories and possibilities. The truth had been named, tried, and punished. Emily Carter's parents didn't feel relief exactly. Relief implied a kind of satisfaction, and nothing about losing their only daughter could ever be satisfying. What they felt was clarity, a closing of the gap that had tortured them for 12 years. The nights of waking in panic, the birthdays spent imagining where she might be, the constant ache of the unknown had all given way to one unshakable reality. Emily hadn't disappeared. She had been hidden. Greg and Linda held a private memorial service in the same garden Emily had loved to tend as a child. Her favorite flowers, lilac, daisies, and tulips had been planted anew. A stone bench was placed beside the flower bed with her name engraved on it. People stopped by often. Some brought flowers. Others just sat in silence. For them, the garden was sacred. A place to remember what was lost and to reflect on how long the truth had been just out of reach. The old house on Oak Ridge Lane was now a memory. After it was demolished, the lot sat empty for a year before a local artist group proposed turning it into a public green space. They planted trees, laid a brick walking path, and built a small plaque in Emily's honor. It wasn't flashy, just a quiet place tucked between homes, where children could play and neighbors could pause under the shade of tall trees. In many ways, it felt like the only fitting conclusion. From a place of silence and horror had come something peaceful. Yet, even as Maple Glen found new footing, the deeper echoes of the case lingered. For some, especially those who had attended Emily and Daniel's engagement party, who had smiled and clapped and posed for pictures just weeks before the tragedy, the guilt was hard to shake. They replayed old memories, wondering how they missed the signs. Could something in Daniel's eyes have given him away? Was there a hint in Emily's voice that they had ignored? The story made its way into national headlines again after a documentary crew visited the town. They filmed interviews with former investigators, friends, and experts in criminal psychology. The episode, titled Buried Beneath the Vows, aired 6 months after Daniel's sentencing and reignited interest in the case. Viewers across the country were shocked by the idea that a bride could vanish without a trace, only to be discovered years later just feet from where she was last seen. But for Maple Glen, the media attention brought mixed feelings. Some residents welcomed the spotlight. It was a reminder that Emily mattered, that her story had reached beyond their small community. Others found it invasive, a reopening of wounds they had tried to heal. But everyone agreed on one thing: the story had to be told. Not just for Emily, but for others like her, those who had gone missing, whose names still appeared on posters, whose families still waited for answers. In prison, Daniel Brooks remained largely unresponsive. He didn't speak to the media. He refused interviews. When asked by psychologists whether he regretted what he'd done, he reportedly gave no answer. His silence was as chilling as it had been on the day of his arrest. He spent most of his time alone, reading and walking in the prison yard. But no book, no step, no moment could undo what he had done. He had buried more than a body. He had buried trust, hope, and the life of a woman who had once loved him. Emily's story began to be used in training sessions for detectives and forensic experts. Her case highlighted the importance of second looks, of trusting intuition, of never assuming the obvious. The mistake of not checking beneath the floors in the early days of the investigation was studied in classrooms and seminars. It was a painful reminder that sometimes evil hides in the spaces that seem too ordinary to question. The impact stretched even further. A bill named Emily's Law was introduced in the state legislature, proposing mandatory forensic reevaluations of cold cases every 5 years. It passed with overwhelming support. Emily's name, once only whispered with grief, now appeared in legal documents and reform efforts. Her story had sparked change, something she could never have known she would do. For Julia, Emily's best friend, the truth offered a complicated kind of closure. She still kept the letter Emily had written, still read it on sleepless nights. Sometimes she visited the garden and talked out loud to the wind, telling Emily about her own life, the people she'd met, the things she wished they could have done together. She often wondered what would have happened if she'd said something sooner, if she had urged Emily to run or convinced her to cancel the wedding entirely. But guilt, she came to learn, was a heavy thing to carry alone. Over time, the town grew. New families moved in, new businesses opened. But certain stories remained carved into the sidewalks, spoken in low voices to those who cared enough to listen. Emily Carter became more than just a bride who vanished. She became a symbol of how darkness can live behind smiles, how pain can hide in plain sight, and how no secret stays buried forever. As the seasons changed and the garden grew, the flowers bloomed brighter each year. Children ran along the path, laughing, unaware of what had once happened just a few feet away. And maybe that was how healing worked, not by forgetting, but by building something new in the space where something precious had been lost. Emily's parents continued to visit the garden, never missing a birthday or anniversary. They knew that grief doesn't end when justice is served. But they also knew that truth is powerful. It doesn't erase the pain, but it lets you breathe again. It brings light to the dark corners. And for Emily, that light had finally found its way through the floorboards, through the silence, through the years. She had been hidden. Now she was seen.